Thank you so much for coming as we continue for our Winter Meet the Author series. We'll be serving wine after the event as well, so don't stress if you haven't. I'd like to mention that programs at the library are made possible by our annual Friends of the Library campaign, so thank you so much for your continued support to make programs like these and our collections available to the community. I would also like to thank a few people here tonight, and that is first, Rosanna Nissen at Barrett Bookstore. She was the person who actually got tonight's speaker, and we're very grateful to her. She is, yes. She's always indispensable at for our events. And the next is Kaylee George, who is actually our library marketing rep for HarperCollins. She came here tonight from the city, and then I put her to work, and she's actually serving wine. So thank you, Kaylee. And I would also like to thank Margaret Spear of Wave Hill Bread Bakery and Cafe. She provided some of the goodies that are here, and she emailed us yesterday and asked if she could bring bread. And I was like, oh, free treats, yes, thank you, absolutely. And then finally, I would very especially like to thank Nicholas Roberts Fine Wine. That's Nick and Peter Trujillo who are here tonight. A few months ago, I contacted Nick and I said, hey, we're having this event it was originally November, and we would just love it if you could maybe consider donating a couple cases of wine. And he said, not only will we donate a couple of cases of wine, but we'll actually sell those cases, and 10% of the proceeds from that will benefit the library. So thank you so much for your generosity. And that wine is courtesy of Nicholas Roberts, right down the Post Road. I'm also so grateful that we were able to reschedule tonight's event. As some of you may know, it was originally scheduled for November 1st, which was smack dab in the middle of the Hurricane Sandy reckoning. And at that time, I was emailing with Rosanna at Barrett Bookstore and our guest publicist, Andy, and we were like, what should we do? Should we reschedule? Should we cancel? Should we just, the show must go on? But the thing that we did all agree on was that we would all need a giant glass of wine when this was over. So we're very happy that our guest was very willing and gracious and excited to reschedule tonight's event. Tonight's guest is the chief wine critic of the New York Times. His weekly column appears in the dining section, and he contributes to the Diner's Journal blog on the Times' website. Before he started writing full-time about wine in 2004, he wrote primarily about restaurants and food. He created the $25 and under restaurant reviews in 1992 and wrote them through 2004. He is co-author of 5 editions of the New York Times Guide to Restaurants and published 4 editions of $25 and Under, a guide to the best inexpensive restaurants in New York. He is joining us tonight from New York City. And something I would just like to say about the book, How to Love Wine, is that my father every single year tells us for Christmas that he has everything and all he wants in this world is wine and books. So here is something perfect for someone like that, because it's a book about loving wine, a memoir, and a manifesto. Please join me in welcoming to Darien Library, Mr. Eric Asimov.
It's such a pleasure to be here, and as Erin said, I'm so glad that we could reschedule this, and that it wasn't just another casualty of Sandy. I'm very happy that we're also serving wine tonight. It's always my strategy to get the crowd liquored up. And I'm especially happy by the choice of the 2 wines that we're serving tonight, because they very much illustrate one of the key themes of my book, which is that this is, right now, the greatest time in history ever to be a wine lover. We have today a greater diversity of wines from more places in the world, in more styles, expressing more points of view than ever before. And it's really just an evolution that's occurred in the last 20 years and seems to be accelerating year by year. So these 2 wines, which you may have tried already or you will soon enough, One of them is a Moscofilero from Greece, a white wine that actually has a little bit of a pinkish tinge to it. Nobody ever heard of this grape 10 years ago, a Moscofilero. It's conceivable that some of you have never heard of it until tonight. But it's just an example of the wonderful, almost cornucopia of wines that have been made for eons throughout the old world and are slowly becoming available here as creative importers seek out long-established traditional wines in Europe and bring them here. The red wine is it's a Trapat. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing it correctly. It's an odd form of Catalan, I guess. It's from a northeastern corner of Spain. It's a very sort of pale red wine, and it usually, that grape is usually used for cava, the sparkling wine of Spain, which they drink unbelievable amounts. Or it goes into rosés, but very rarely do you see it in a straightforward red wine. And it's just it's a pleasant, refreshing, light, delicious wine, and it's just wonderful that we have not only that these wines are available to us tonight, but that we have a store like Nicholas Roberts that seeks out wines like this and really feels strongly about turning people on to these wines. So I want to talk a little bit first about how I came to write this book, and then I'll read a brief passage of it, and then we'll do if you have any questions, I'll be happy to answer them. We'll do a little Q&A. There were really two motivations for writing this book. First of all is the fact that we have all these great wines available to us today, and it's just an unbelievable amount of pleasure that's just waiting to be experienced. The second is that, you know, I, as part of my job, wine critic since 2004, I talk to people all the time about wine. Mostly they want to talk to me about wine, and often it comes across as they're telling me their troubles about wine, as if I'm a shrink at a cocktail party, or you know, a priest that they're confessing to. And very often the conversation goes something like this: you know, I really like wine, but all those aromas and smell, those aromas and flavors that people keep talking about, I just don't get it. I can't. I don't sense it when I smell the wine. I don't taste it. I guess there must be something wrong with me. And always it ends with a person finding fault in themselves. And this happened so often that I began to think, why? What is it about our American wine culture that is causing people to feel anxious about wine? I mean, it's an old, everybody in the industry knows that people are intimidated by wine. But why? I mean, it's really there just to give us pleasure. It's a simple thing. And yet, it causes a lot of anxiety, a lot of intimidation, feelings of inadequacy. I told you, I'm like a shrink. So I started thinking about, first, how we talk about wine, the language that we use. And so often, it's now the conventional wisdom that one talks about wine with the language of tasting notes. And you've all seen the tasting notes in the back of consumer magazines where they'll list hundreds of bottles and describe them, notes of grapefruit or guava or fig paste or melted road tar and chocolate, and it gets really esoteric, and you get things that people have no idea what the references are. Maduro tobacco and gooseberries and it's a list of flavors and aromas. And if you saw the movie Sideways, you saw just a brilliant parody of Miles teaching the other guy, whose name I can't remember, how to taste wine, and putting it up to his nose and putting the other hand to the side of his head, the ear. I don't know why people do that, as it sort of amplifies the aromas of the glass. It's just a common pose. And people, very often, many people, they don't experience wine that way. And they assume that maybe they're the only one. Maybe there's something wrong with them. Must be them, because that's what the experts do. And I started thinking about the way we talk about wine so often in terms of the 100-point scale, the way we think about wine. You've all seen the 100-point scale. It goes along with the tasting note. And it's an effort to place every wine, no matter where it comes from, why it's produced, what its purpose is, what the producers had in mind. It puts it all on the same universal scale and compares them to one another and comes out with a number. And I'm sympathetic to people who rely on those numbers, because if you go into the big, if you go into a supermarket, for example, or the big chain wine stores where you've got walls of bottles and you don't recognize any of the names, and there's nobody there who knows the bottles and can explain them to you, you need something to help you differentiate from them. Enter the score. And so you don't have to know a whole lot about wine to know that the 95-point wine is better than the 85-point wine, right? All you have to do is have gone to school in this country and you get it. The problem is that scores ignore one of probably the most important part of, the most important feature in the way people experience wine, which is context. Who you're with when you're drinking wine, what you're eating, what the temperature is outside, what your mood is, if you've had a fight with your spouse or significant other, that wine is not going to taste nearly as good as it will if you're on a romantic date and everything is going well. Then it's the best wine you've ever had. And many people have had this experience of going to the shop and having to select among the bottles and deciding, well, the 92-point bottle is better than the 85-point bottle, so I'm going to get that bottle. They bring it home and open it, and they've cooked dinner, and maybe it's a Tuesday night, and they've just roasted a chicken or made some meatloaf or whatever, and they drink this 92-point wine, and it's not so good with the food. And why is that? Well, because many critics reserve their higher scores for wines that are made to age over time, that are going to likely be somewhat tannic or inaccessible in their youth, and when you try to drink it with your meal, it's like, it's not so good. And people have had the other experience where they've bought the 85-point wine because maybe they didn't want to spend a few extra dollars, and they found that, hey, this wine is great with this food. Why? Because the less The lower scoring wine may be just a fresh wine, made to be consumed right away, not a serious wine, not meant to demonstrate the greatness of the wine producer, and it's really good. And what happens? You prefer the 85-point wine over the 92-point wine. There must be something wrong with me. I guess I don't get it. The experts have to be right. So you have these experiences as consumers that just don't square with what you're told you should be experiencing. And I thought about how people arrive at these scores and at their tasting notes. And if you can envision the environment in which wine critics are doing their tasting. They come in the morning, they haven't brushed their teeth because they don't want to influence their palate. They haven't had coffee for the same reason, so they're grumpy. You're coming into a clinical room where you've got the bright fluorescent lights shining down on these bottles like interrogation lights. You've got 75 or 100 glasses in front of you before lunch. And you're going to taste quickly, roll it around in your mouth and in your mind, write down your little notes. Maybe if you're really conscientious, taste it again, give it a score, and move on. And again, you've ignored the most important ways that people drink wine. You've ignored the fact that wine is going to change over time. It changes in the bottle, it ages over years. It changes in the glass as the temperature of the wine warms up, as it's exposed to more air, as you eat, and depending on what your mood is, as I said. All these things are not part of the equation. And so the scores and the notes are written and conceived in an artificial environment. And of course, wine professionals are smart enough to know that, so they try to extrapolate and imagine what things might be like under different conditions. And I say they're smart enough, but not all of them actually believe that, as I do. They think they're doing the most objective possible evaluation of a wine. They're treating each bottle like they're part of Consumer Reports, and they're testing a toaster or seeing how fast a car goes 0 to 60. But again, wine doesn't conform to these kind of objective criteria. And just trying to take a snapshot of it at one point in its life, it can be extremely misleading. And again, it leads to consumers having a different experience with the wine they purchase than the way that the experts have described it and led you to believe you're going to experience it. So I also started thinking about how people learn about wine. We tell them, read this one book, it will tell you everything you need to know about wine. Or read this one book, it will give you 10 mnemonic ways to remember how not to embarrass yourself in front of your boss or in front of a date. Here's the way that 10 methods to know, always choose the right wine from the list. And of course, this is impossible. Learning about wine from one book is like learning how to ski by reading a book, or learning how to play golf, or learning about opera or jazz. You have to experience it. You have to do it, and sometimes for many years before you can really develop that that ease and confidence. We tell people to take wine appreciation classes, as if learning about wine is just another sign of civilization. It's a genteel skill that we all must master. But to me, that phrase, wine appreciation, it just takes the guts out of wine. Wine is not something to appreciate, it's something to love, something to fall for. It's got guts in it, it's got, it's earth and blood and iron and elemental. And when we treat it as, as if it's the equivalent of plastic slip covers or room deodorizers, just something that is an emblem of civilization, it ignores what wine really is. That's another thing that happens when you're in that clinical environment and you are trying to taste that wine with the utmost objectivity. You're essentially depriving yourself of any knowledge about that wine, because we've decided that to be truly objective, you can't know who made that wine or where it comes from. You have to taste it blind, because wine critics would be biased if they knew anything about where it came from, what the history of that particular wine was, and how it behaves over time. I personally find that sort of an infantilizing thought. We don't require book critics to know nothing about the author. No, we know about what the author's thoughts and philosophy is, and we know what film directors think about when they make their movies. We don't deprive the film critic of knowing who made that movie. Why would we want to do that with wine? It's very important where it comes from. I believe that good wines, in fact, are expressions of culture. They tell you an awful lot about the place that the grapes were grown, the people who made the wine, the culture that those people are part of. And if you're prevented from looking at that, you're depriving yourself of an awful lot of meaning that can be in the glass. Because wine is not just about aromas and flavors, as the tasting notes would lead you to believe. It's really about people and culture and place. But our method of discussing wine seems to put all of this together. It seemed to me that the message that our American wine culture conveys to consumers is essentially that in order to experience the pleasure of wine, you have to know everything about it first. You've got to study it, you've got to memorize. Essentially, you've got to become a connoisseur before you can really have that pleasure. And I know I'm exaggerating a little bit. Everybody here enjoys wine, and as I said to begin with, people say they like wine, but it's that feeling that they don't know enough about it that causes them anxiety. And it seemed to me that this formula is backwards. You don't pursue rational knowledge first. You pursue an emotional connection. You develop an emotional connection, just as you would with anything in your life that you really love. If you don't have that emotional connection with it, why would you want to study it? Because you don't want to embarrass yourself, or you want to look good in front of your boss or a date? Well, that's the rationale that we're given, that's conveyed. No, I think you want to develop that emotional connection first, and if you find that you
do like wine, even love wine, that can be enough. You can enjoy it. But there's a lot more, and you can plunge deeply into it if you're moved to. But then it's an act of volition. You're compelled to by your interest. You're not obliged to. So the subtitle, that's why I decided to call my book How to Love Wine, because it's really about developing this emotional connection first, and then following it up, if you're moved to, by studying it. And the subtitle is a memoir and manifesto. And I've kind of covered the ground of the manifesto part. But I thought I would also talk about how I fell in love with wine, which was really as a very organic process of drinking a lot of really cheap wine as a graduate student, because that's what I could afford. And it was a very different experience from, what some of my favorite wine writers, who happen to be British, like Jancis Robinson or Hugh Johnson, talk about. For them, they went to Cambridge and Oxford and joined the Wine Society, and these societies would compete against one another in sort of academic blind tastings. And they had deep cellars of the greatest wines ever made, and that's what they would learn on. They would drink these wonderful, wonderful wines. But that's a very privileged, almost aristocratic way of going about things, and it's not the way wine-producing cultures did it. In wine-producing cultures, of which Britain did not used to be one, but now it is, global warming. In wine-producing cultures, it was just part of the table. It was on the table. It was a food product, a staple. If you lived in a wine-producing region centuries ago, most likely you were a farmer of one sort or another. Subsistence farmers grew grains, vegetables, raised an animal or two, and had some vines. And you either made your own wine or you took it to the local wine press and had it made. And that's where things stayed. You drank the local wine, and the people in the next valley drank their local wine, and it was a different wine. That's why when importers go to Europe today, they can constantly discover these new expressions like Mascofilero or Trepat that we have tonight, because there's seemingly an infinite variety of wines that in our sort of post-industrial wine culture we don't have, because we chose the wines that we were going to plant, and so we modeled our wine production on reproducing the best wines of Europe. That's why we have Cabernet and Chardonnay and Pinot Noir and Cabernet and Chardonnay repeated again and again. And no, as far as I know, there's no Trepat or Mascofilero grown anywhere in this country yet. So my own experience with wine started out when I was a very sullen teenager. Sullen because I had my first girlfriend one summer when I was 14 years old, and this was the most thrilling thing ever in my life. And my parents decided to wrench me away from my new girlfriend and take me with them on a trip to France, which they naturally were very excited to be going to in the early 70s, and I should have been excited as well, but no, I was just unhappy to be leaving this girl. And we're in Paris, and my mother was pretty much sick of me scowling about. My father was a newspaper man, as they used to call journalists, and he had some friends who worked for the the International Paris Tribune, and he was going off to lunch with them. And my mother said, "Take him with you." She was just sick of me. And so he did. And so we went to a bistro in Paris that's still there to this day, Allard, it's called. And went in, sat down, and proceeded to have the kind of the awakening of my life up to that point, where, wow, it was just the most incredible meal, the most vivid, vibrant flavors. And it was something very simple, an entrecôte, which is like a little rib steak, haricots verts, green beans, dauphinoise, potatoes. But we were coming from a TV dinner culture, instant coffee, things like that, better living through chemistry. And this was the beginnings of the food revolution in this country. My mother was a fan of Julia Child, and this was a direction, this is what we were after, food that had real flavors. And it was so wonderful, and I was eating this great meal, feeling proud, because there I was with my father and his friends, and they let me have a little bit of wine, which was a red wine. I don't remember what it was, but it was on the table. And this became the model for me, an experience I wanted to reproduce again and again. Great food, friends, family, loved ones, and wine. It all went together, and it made life so much better. And so I came back home and was on fire, and I was one of those kids that couldn't walk down a city street without looking at every restaurant menu I passed, and got to college. I actually, before college, I wrote beer reviews for my high school newspaper. This was the 70s, and this sort of thing was permitted. Nowadays, as a parent, I would be appalled. But eventually, I got to graduate school at the University of Texas at Austin. And I lived with some friends, and we cooked dinner every night, and we had wine on the table. And these were the cheap wines, usually 1.5 liter bottles of stuff from the south of France, Minervois, or some bad Italian wine. It was just mostly bad wine. And in this era, you didn't have wine from South America or Australia. You barely had cheap wine from California, and when you did, it was Gallo, and we knew better than that. Maybe not, because the wines that we were getting from Europe weren't very good, but we loved it because it went with the food and the people. And eventually I started drinking better wines by accident almost, but I did. And I left graduate school and decided I would go into journalism as well, and eventually got a job at the New York Times. And I was 26 years old then. I came to New York with the way college students used to travel. We had milk crates full of records and cinder blocks and shelves in our stereo, and that was pretty much it. Except I had boxes of wine too, cheap wine. But I got to New York, and I realized that the one experience I hadn't had was a bottle of really good wine, and I needed an excuse to have that experience. And my parents were about to celebrate their 30th wedding anniversary. And I thought, wow, I could get a 30-year-old bottle of wine from the same vintage as their wedding. And wouldn't that be fun? And back then, the wine region that was widely regarded as the greatest was Bordeaux. And if you wanted to get deeply into wine, you studied Bordeaux. And Bordeaux was the wine that aged the best, and everybody said it was the world's best wine. So I thought, I'll get a 30-year-old bottle of Bordeaux. And I had a friend who worked in a restaurant who could recommend somebody else to help me find this bottle, and I found it, 1955, La Mission Aubryon, a great Bordeaux producer, a great vintage for that wine, unbeknownst to me, but nearly $200. And I was like, oh my God, $200. Well, it was still within the realm of a splurge even for me. And you know, I look back on that now, and if you were to want a 30-year-old bottle of great Bordeaux now, from let's say 1982, man, that would be thousands of dollars, and that's you know, even the inflated salaries that they pay to young out-of-college workers nowadays. No way you could afford that. So I was privileged, and I got that bottle and I took it to my parents' house, and that's the I'm going to now read just for a couple of minutes where we opened that bottle and drank it. I had presented the bottle to Dad and Mom on their anniversary, November 26, 1985, and not long afterward headed out to their house in Roslyn Heights for dinner and wine. Mom had prepared lamb chops, a classic accompaniment to fine Bordeaux, and with great excitement and some nervousness, we prepared to decant the bottle. I had read up on the age-old ritual of pouring the wine over a lighted candle in order to be able to see the first signs of sediment entering the neck of the bottle. A candle seemed overly precious, so I used a flashlight. And slowly, standing over the kitchen sink so as not to spill a drop in Mom's spotless kitchen, I poured the wine into a glass pitcher etched with roses. With the bottle now empty, except for a tantalizing bit at the bottom full of sediment, we took turns burying our faces in the pitcher to breathe it all in. You didn't need to be a wine scholar to know that this was something unusually fine and wonderful. As I inhaled the aromas of the wine, I felt the sentimental history of my family wash over me, of the hopes and dreams of Mom and Dad over their 30 years of marriage, of the lives they had built for themselves, and of the lives that their children, now adults, were trying to build. I was now 28 years old, the same age my father was when I was born. Where would I be in 30 years, I wondered? Where would we all be? Yes, I was moved by the emotional and symbolic value of this wine, but most of all, I remember how great the wine smelled. While it was hard for me to be entirely clinical in assessing it, simply because of the emotional context of opening this bottle, I couldn't help noting that the complexity and beauty of the aromas were unlike anything I had tried before. How do you serve a bottle of great wine? Today, with so much information to confuse matters, I can imagine being paralyzed with anxiety. Do I have the right glasses? Can one drink Bordeaux from a Burgundy glass or vice versa? What about the decanter? Must you cover it? Is the wine at the proper temperature? I've heard all these questions so often, and so many more just like them, and I completely understand. Whether you're spending $10, $20, $200, or $1,000 for a bottle, everybody wants to get their money's worth. Particularly with expensive bottles, expectations are heightened sometimes to ridiculous levels. We all think we need to be specialists, skilled in arcane arts to reach the threshold necessary to enjoy a glass of wine. The truth is that wine can be one of the simplest pleasures available to anybody. Pour beverage into glass, drink, enjoy. That's 90% of it right there. Anybody can do that, right? The rest of it is just enhancements. Did you ever see the tiny baseball gloves used back in Babe Ruth's time? They looked like little more than padded mittens, and at the end of an inning, when the fielders ran in to take their turn at bat, they stuffed their gloves into their back pockets. Were they not able to play the game with great skill despite lacking the refinement of today's tools? Of course they were. Ability was in the players, not in the gloves or the bats they use, just as the pleasure is in the wine and in the human ability to enjoy it, not in the particular sort of glassware involved. Not to say that good quality glasses are not a fine thing. Good glasses absolutely enhance the enjoyment of a fine wine, but precise matches of glassware to bottle border on the absurd. Back in 1985, I didn't think about the glasses we used. Mom had two kinds of wine glasses, ordinary-looking goblets and heavier, fancier ones she had inherited from her mother, with a glass beading that embellished the bowls. I never liked those glasses. They felt heavy and shallow. So we poured the 30-year-old La Mission into the sorts of glasses you might find on the table at any neighborhood bistro. If I had such a wonderful bottle of wine today, I might make it the centerpiece of a dinner, building up to it with another bottle or two. Back then, I had no real sense of scale, and my parents might have considered 2 bottles of wine at dinner to be decadent and unhealthy. So we just plunged right in with dinner, sitting at the round white kitchen table where I had eaten so many meals growing up, gorging on the lamb chops and potatoes and sipping this extraordinary wine that seemed to epitomize both grace and intensity. What did the wine taste like? I knew somebody would ask me that. Forgive me if I choose not to grope through the usual lexicon of fruits, flowers, herbs, spices, and so on. To say that the 55 La Mission smelled like pencil shavings, violets, truffles, and cedar may be correct on some vague level, but it was irrelevant to the pleasure we took in this wine and ultimately pointless information for assessing the wine. Better to say that each sip was both a joy and a challenge. One could simply enjoy a wine like this for its deliciousness, the way one can enter a museum gallery and take in a group of paintings with swift glances, admiring each and emerging with a sense of pleasure, yet without feeling changed. I know we all loved the wine on that level. We sighed and pronounced it beautiful. We toasted Mom and Dad in their 30 years together. Mom still has that bottle sitting on a shelf near a portrait of Dad. But even amid the celebratory joy of the meal, I remember being mesmerized by the wine. I was riveted by my glass, as if it were a saison, still life, in which you discover the apple that appeared to be red on first glance was actually myriad different shades and contours that collectively added up to red, but were in fact much more. It's not necessary for anybody to take the time to examine what's in a glass of wine, just as nobody feels obliged to stop in front of a painting for prolonged study. I don't begrudge anybody the choice of accepting the easy enjoyment and moving on to the next thing. But if you are inclined to stop and focus, well, then a wine like the 1955 La Mission has countless emotions, angles, and vistas to reveal, in itself and in you. Just as a postscript, my mother's comment on that, my mother who's 90 years old now, she said, "I'm glad it meant so much to you. I don't really remember it." But she does have the bottle. Nowadays, what's so wonderful about these days for loving wine is that even though we can't afford, most of us would be hard-pressed to afford a 30-year-old bottle from a great vintage, we have so many more choices of great wines that don't have to be just the benchmark wines. They can be Barolos or Brunellos. They can be Riojas. They can be Napa Cabernets. There are great wines from so many different parts of the world. They can be German Rieslings. They can be Tokaj from Hungary. Wines from Sicily. I'm obsessed with them right now. Wonderful wines. And so that's really the purpose of the book, not to change the way we talk about wine so much, because that seems like a really daunting prospect. The scores and the tasting notes are entrenched. But for people who really do care about wine and who want to learn more about it, my hope is that my book causes you to question some of these assumptions that we have about wine, and in the process feel simply more comfortable and more at ease to experience wine as you choose to, rather than trying to force yourself into the mold that's been created by our own wine experts. Well, thank you very much, and if you do have any questions, I'm very happy to answer them. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Among the well-known wine critics, are there some that are less overly clinical and more consonant with the way you would look at wine than others?
Well, absolutely. I personally think that the days of, and this is for people who really care about wine, the days of the long litany of tasting notes and scores and hundreds of wines in the back of the magazine, I think are on the downward trend right now. I think that back in the 80s, when this model of consumer publication began, you didn't have that many sources for wine information in this country. And there were perhaps good reasons not to trust the sources, and you all remember the stereotype of the supercilious sommelier who would sneer at you as they're trying to rip you off. But nowadays, we've kind of decentralized wine knowledge, so that you don't need to go to the one global critic. You've got people at stores like Nicholas Robert, or at great restaurants where sommeliers are among the most passionate people I know about wine, and wine merchants, and they're dying to turn you on to wines that they love. So I'm a big fan of trusting your sommelier, developing a relationship with your wine merchant, because these people know their wines better and in more circumstances than would be revealed in those clinical tasting notes. That said, I'm a big fan of the inspirational form of wine writing, where you're not offering a consumer report on myriad bottles, but you're talking about people and regions, and by discussing the culture of wine, you're inspiring thirst, essentially, and curiosity. And some of the people who write that way include people like Hugh Johnson, who for me is somebody I aspire to be like. I think he's brilliant. Kermit Lynch in our country, who wrote a seminal wine book 30 years ago, 25 years ago, back in the late 80s, called Adventures on the Wine Route, which is essentially a story of a pessimistic story of how one age of producing wine had ended, essentially, and at that point it seemed that we're entering an age of industrial wine production, where the small family farms were disappearing. And thankfully, because of people like Kermit Lynch and books like that, we've reversed that, which is why we have so many wonderful wines to choose from now. One of my favorite recent books on wine is about the wines of Sicily, and it's really about the culture of Sicily as told through its wine and its wine producers. It's called Palmento, P-A-L-M-E-N-T-O, by Robert Camuto, and you might find it in the library here, or certainly at Barrett's Books. I highly recommend that. I also think if you want good wine journalism, The San Francisco Chronicle has a terrific wine writer, John Bonet, and of course everything is now available on the internet, so you don't have to be in San Francisco to read him. And there are great wine bloggers and all kinds of sources now that didn't exist 10 or 15 years ago. Yes, ma'am.
In addition to speaking to your wine purveyor, are there any helpful hints to help the consumer find a wine with a lower alcoholic content?
Are there helpful hints to help consumers find wines with lower alcohol levels? And you know, it's obvious that if you follow wine closely, one of the things that differentiates many of today's wines from the wines of 20 years ago is a much higher alcohol level. What used to be typical in table wines, say 12 or 12.5%, now, especially in wines produced in this country, is maybe 14.5%, and a lot of wines go a lot higher than that. And it's not just a difference of 2 percentage points. 2 percentage points coming from a base of 12% is, well, it's, you know, you're bordering on a 20% higher level of alcohol. And it's pretty clear we're not going to go back to the age of 12% wines. That, you know, global warming is one reason. Grapes get a lot more ripe, and also changes in viticulture allow grapes to get a lot more ripe. But what you do see right now, especially in this country, is a little bit of a pendulum swing, whereas 10 years ago, the major critics of this country were effusive in their praise for these big, powerful, alcoholic fruit bombs, is what they're often called. Today, there's a lot more diversity of opinion, and people who prefer more balanced, restrained wines have now more choices. So how to find them, you know, it's still the best way is to talk to your merchants, to pick out critics who might prefer wines like that and might point you in their direction. I might be one of those people. And to just keep your eyes on the label. You know, people who support those big, powerful wines will argue that alcohol is just a number. The question is whether the wine is balanced. And I personally don't agree with that. Aside from not wanting, I like to drink a lot of wine. And I don't want to have to moderate my intake because the wine is more powerful. But even more important than that, when you have a lot of alcohol in a wine, it makes its texture and body heavier. There's more glycerin in the wine. It gives it a thicker texture. And I like wines that are more light-bodied, and ethereal is probably too highfalutin a word there, but lighter and fresher.
Would a newer wine be lighter in alcohol?
A newer wine, I'm sorry, a younger? Younger?
Yeah, might be.
No. You know, once the wine is in the bottle, the alcohol level is more or less set. And actually what happens is, you know, when wine is aging in barrels, it tends to, a little bit of the water in the wine tends to evaporate, and which is why most of the time they're constantly refilling the barrels so that you don't get a pocket of air in the barrel. But it's the water that evaporates. So as it ages in the barrel, the alcohol level intensifies slightly.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Time for 2 more questions.
2 more questions. Okay. Yes, ma'am.
I have 2 questions. I have a million questions. So first of all, I'd love a recommendation on a local winery to visit, maybe in the Big Lakes or something, somewhere you've been to that is good local wine and know. And then I have another question. So we've moved from corks to screw tops. Is there anything in your experience of the process of making wine that you think will in the future change the taste of wine? Is there anything that is going to make it economically or more eco-friendly in the production of wine that you think will change the flavour of wine or how it's grown?
Well, to answer your second question first, I think it's most wine producers' aim is to find ways of packaging that don't change the flavor. They want what they regard as a finished wine to be experienced in its more or less pristine form without being affected by the packaging. And that has been a problem. Most of you have heard of corked wines, where you have a microscopic amount of mold in the cork that will mar the wine, and classically you can detect it if the wine smells like wet cardboard or old newspapers or something like that. And it got to the point where maybe 5% or so of the bottles were affected, and people started looking for alternatives like the screw top. And in a classic example of unintended consequences, by changing that closure, they created new conditions for the wine and found that they had to subtly alter their winemaking, because the screw top, unlike the cork, did not allow tiny bits of air to interact with the wine, and because of that, people were finding off aromas and in the wine that sometimes could blow away with exposure to air, but sometimes not. So you can't just change the enclosure. You have to actually slightly change the chemistry of the wine. Are there eco-friendly ways beyond that? I don't know. For a while, I was very excited about the bag-in-the-box technology, and we all know that box wines have a bad name. We think of that they're cheap and awful, the way we used to think of screw caps. But in fact, it's quite an ingenious way of packaging wine, where the bag inside the box shrinks every time you pour a little wine out, and so it doesn't let any air in, and that way the wine can preserve for a long time. The problem is that just as we've come to be a little bit suspicious of plastic bottles for water and a little bit concerned with the chemicals that might leach into the water, I've become a little bit uncomfortable with whether any chemicals leach from these plastic bags into the wine because of the alcohol. So I'm waiting for a chemist to explain the process and relieve me of my anxiety. The last part of your question, local wines. Well, I have not had Connecticut wines, although I'm told they're made, and I'm told that some of them are pretty good. In New York, you have the North Fork of Long Island, and one of my favorite places to visit there is Shinn Estate, S-H-I-N-N, and that's a terrific. They make terrific wines. The Finger Lakes, I'm a big fan of. I'm very big on a lot of Finger Lakes wines. Ravines, Herman J. Wiemer, Blooming. Now I'm blanking on it. Blooming Creek, Heart and Hands. A lot of good producers in the Finger Lakes worth visiting. Did that cover our 2 questions, or do we have one more? One more. Yes, sir.
Yes, hi. I wanted to ask, as you're a wine lover and critic, with the slow food movement, would you care to comment on that, and also the push for, one would say, I guess, organic wines or organic grapes? These terms get, pushed around quite a bit.
Yeah.
Biology, I guess, in Europe, and the push to try to maybe label wines for what their ingredients are. How do you feel about that with Proposition 13 out in California that wasn't passed?
Well, I think it's very important and very helpful to think of wine the way we think of food. In a lot of ways, how we feel about wine trails how we feel about food by a decade. And I think people have become more and more concerned with where their food comes from. We know that the methods of production, the methods of agriculture are very important. I think the growth of organic as a commercial incentive is clear because the big food companies have basically co-opted the term by weakening the definition so they can do what they used to do, but just label their foods organic now. We've come to appreciate local ingredients. And I think that, well, first of all, it's clear that however important those feelings are, it's generally, it only applies to a minority of the public. The majority is always going to be going to fast food restaurants and franchise restaurants, and people are satisfied with that. But more and more people do experience those sorts of places as either unhealthy or inauthentic or really not the best expressions of food. And I think you can make the same differentiation in wine. You have your mass production wines that are similar to the Olive Gardens and Red Lobster franchise restaurants, fast food restaurants, and many people are satisfied with that. They find it palatable, and that's really what they're interested in. And then you have wines that I feel are cultural expressions that have a point of view, much like independent restaurants where you have a chef who has a point of view and wants to create his or her own menu and hasn't simply taken a focus group profile of the public and caters to what he perceives they want. You have that difference in wine. There are a lot of wines that are just created to fit a focus group profile. We're going to make a wine that hits those buttons. And honestly, I'm not interested in those wines, and I don't write about them very often unless it's an interesting business story. But just as wine, I'm not interested in that any more than I'd be interested in a franchise restaurant. I'm interested in those wines that express a point of view, have some sort of personal or cultural expression, express a year and a place rather than are shaped to fit a profile. And a lot of this book, in fact, is about how to recognize those wines and the differences between the two kinds of wines. And just as a parent and as a human being, I am concerned about the quality of the agriculture or viticulture. I prefer wines where poisons are not sprayed on the grapes. And I think that more and more good winemakers recognize the importance, both as it applies to the quality of their wine and as conscientious human beings dealing with workers who are out in the fields amongst those poisons. Labeling, I do think I would be in favor of transparency on wine labels. The wine industry will tell you that it will just confuse the public, and I don't think the public has been I don't know if they've been confused by food labeling. It seems to me that people either pay attention to it or they don't. And I think the same would be true in wine. I think there'll be an initial sort of bits of surprise, you know, exclamations of astonishment to know that, you know, you might find things like fish bladder or egg whites among the ingredients in wine. Yeah, these are tools that are used to clarify wine, but essentially by the time you drink it, they're no longer in the wine, but you would still have to list them. And then eventually, you know, people will take less notice of them. So I would like to see that.